Greetings, the internet. Dopamine Junkie here. The time has come. This is going to be my review of Final Fantasy 16. And sit back and buckle up because I have a lot to say about this game. I'm actually going to start by saying I don't think I've ever had such mixed feelings about a video game before in my life, and I do mean that quite literally. So without further ado, we're just going to go ahead and make this little movement right here for you. We can talk about the general placing of all of these games in another video, but yeah. I'm going to go ahead and put this game at the very top of the C tier of Final Fantasy games. And the reason that I'm placing it as low as it is, or as high as it is, depending on how you feel about the game, I feel like it's a really bad example of a Final Fantasy game, while at the same time being a wonderful RPG experience. As contradictory as that might sound, that's kind of my initial impression after my first experiences with the game. I'm going to go ahead and rip the Band-Aid off here and get this out of the way. This game is a blatant Devil May Cry ripoff. I've not had the pleasure of playing 4 or 5 yet. They are definitely on my to-be-played list. But I have extensive experience playing the first 3 Devil May Cry games, and I think the similarities between the combat mechanics of FF16 and Devil May Cry 3 in particular are just... It's way too similar to ignore. I'm sure there's some like Dark Souls, Sekiro, Bloodborne kind of nods in the gameplay as well, but I've never actually played those games, so I can't speak meaningfully on that. But yeah, this game definitely, my first impression within the first 10 hours of playing it was that it's a blatant Devil May Cry ripoff. But on that note, it's a really fun Devil May Cry ripoff, and this is where the mixed feelings of the game come in. In regards to how the game exactly feels like a DMC ripoff, it's basically just in the nuances of the combat. It's like being able to jump off of enemies' heads and combo enemies somewhat infinitely in the air. The floatiness of enemies really feels a lot like they do in DMC3. The unique flair of each icon really mirrors the unique flair of each weapon in DMC3. The Titan setup or whatever feels a lot like a mix of Beowulf and Royal Guard, for example. But I think the most egregious example is how Clive's basic moveset has both Dante's Stinger and his Helm Divide as, basic moves. He plays a lot like Dante, is what I'm getting at, as someone who's put a lot of hours into S-ranking missions on DMD mode in the first 3 DMC games. Reminded me a lot of DMC gameplay, and it's not a bad thing. Another pretty egregious example is Limit Break is just straight up Devil Trigger in every regard. It causes your HP to regenerate, it has a functionally identical meter. Like the little Limit Break segments are the Devil Trigger orbs from DMC. Yeah, it's the same shit. It's basically the same game, but with a Final Fantasy skin. And if you are a Final Fantasy veteran, you'll notice that Final Fantasy has, actually made a name for itself by doing that. The original Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest ripoff. Final Fantasy XI, blatant EverQuest ripoff. Final Fantasy XIV, blatant World of Warcraft ripoff. Now, 14 did Warcraft better than Warcraft. A lot of people would say that 11 did EverQuest better than EverQuest, but I have personally not played 11 to that extent, and I can't speak meaningfully on that. I'm also a little EverQuest biased. But the point being is that Square has made a name for themselves, kind of putting their own spin on other IPs, and they've become my favorite gaming series by doing so. I don't know. So it's not always a bad thing to copy if you copy well, and while being a blatant Devil May Cry feeling game, I think 16 still manages to be pretty fun. And a lot of that has to do with who developed the game. Yoshi P's track record, particularly with FF14, is nothing short of amazing. The dude has definitely proven himself to be a special case as a game developer. He was able to take that game from a hot steaming pile of garbage to around 4 years later being that WoW killer that people had sort of alluded to being inevitable. It ended up being 14. And I think that no later than Heavensward's release, it had already cemented itself as the better MMO. I know a lot of people are quick to point at the era that like Asmongold was getting into the game and, you know, pulling tens of thousands of viewers streaming it. That era as being the time that FF14 finally killed WoW, but I would say as someone who was playing both games at the same time that it was definitely around the start of Heavensward that FF14 had firmly planted itself in the #1 role. A lot of those raids, particularly A8S and FF14, still hold up to this day mechanically as brilliant examples of raid design fights, and I don't think World of Warcraft ever really got to that same pinnacle level of raid design as 14 was able to get to. But without getting too much into the details of MMOs and all that stuff, long story short is that Yoshi P, when he gets his hands on a project, is able to make a very good game. And, yeah, I can't say that I had a bad experience, even though it definitely wasn't what I was looking for from FF16. I did go in completely blind. I wanted to make sure I had a pure experience without any outside bias kind of blemishing how I felt about the game. I only intended to do a straight playthrough of the game to kind of see the story and as much side content as I felt like doing. With 15 and Kingdom Hearts 3 when they came out, I just zerged the story to try to see as much of it as I could. With this one, I kind of just intentionally kept myself dark on the internet. I still, to this day, haven't seen anything about 16 outside of my own personal playthrough of it. It's been completely untainted by media or other people's opinions or anything. But, yeah, with this one, I kind of just got sucked in, and I ended up on my first playthrough of normal mode before I even knew there was a hard mode, doing everything in the game. I got the strongest weapon, I did all the side quests, I did all of the hunts. We'll go into detail about how I felt about those later, but I kind of did what I would consider to be a 100% playthrough, down to similar to if you've watched my FF10 content on Twitch or whatever. I saw every single dialogue that I could hunt out in the game. You know, I was going back to every area after pretty much every story trigger, talking to the people that you could talk to, and a lot of it was just asinine dick jokes and stupid stuff. But there was, you know, nice little story tidbits here and there. It was a waste of time, definitely, but I did it. I saw as much of that game's content that I could find on my own, and the only thing that I had to look up at the end of it is what that stupid door and the dim was for, because I couldn't figure out on my own. And fun fact, it's for nothing. Nobody knows it. It doesn't do anything. Maybe DLC is what people are speculating, but yeah, as of now, the answer is no. But yeah, I ended up doing a lot more with the game than I intended to. I did what basically would amount to a 100% playthrough twice. I got to level 50, did all the content in normal mode, and then I got to level 100 after doing all the content in Final Fantasy mode.
Ambrosia won't help me
So I think it kind of puts me in a position to like speak from some sort of authority, you know? I wouldn't say like an absolute position of authority, obviously, but I've definitely been around the block with this game. I've spent the past month with it being my main game. I've been distracted by a good bit of EverQuest, but probably could have cut down by another 2 weeks if I wasn't caught up in that. But the point being, I've played a lot of 16. I think it's been enough for me to form a well-founded opinion. And on that note, I'm going to spend the rest of this video talking about what I didn't like about the game first. Then we'll talk about what I did like about the game, what I think it did well. And we'll end up with just my general overall sentiment about it, give it a final rating, and just how I feel about how the Final Fantasy franchise has evolved in general. Alright, so rapid fire round before we get into the details of what I did not like about the game. Too much death, too much violence, too hypersexual, too much Clive ass, potential for a great cast of party members a la FF6, FF7 was just completely thrown to the dogs. Blatant Devil May Cry 3 ripoff, as we've already mentioned. Prey Return to the Waking Sands syndrome, which, just to clarify what that means real quick, Prey Return to the Waking Sands. You'll find yourself going there quite often in FF14. Do a quest, Prey Return to the Waking Sands. Do a quest, Prey Return to the Waking Sands. And this game really suffered from that a lot with the Hideaway. And, yeah, that's my rapid fire round of what I didn't like. Let's get into the nitty-gritty. So the hypersexuality, like the nudity, the weird romantics, I don't need that in my video games, dude. I'm not playing games for that shit. That's weird, right? Like I'm not there for that. I'm trying to have a good gameplay experience that challenges me, an immersive story that, you know, inspires my imagination, what have you. None of that shit does, right? Like I don't care about any of that stuff. That just detracts from a game, in my opinion, and I don't really need to spend much more time talking about that.
You know, I didn't need to see Dion sucking face with his manservant. You know, that stuff. You know, call me a bigot if you like, but I just don't care about stuff like that in video games. Do it in a more nuanced, less in-your-face way, and then I can get behind it a little more. You know, like be suggestive, not so explicit, I guess, is what I'm asking for. Anyway, whatever. Moving on.
To clarify what I mean by the extreme violence or the excessive violence or whatever, I don't really care about the violence during the gameplay. I've killed millions of things in video games in varying brutal ways, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like the emotional violence along with the physical violence in cutscenes, particularly in the beginning of the game. You know, with the scenes leading up to the Phoenix Gate situation and all that stuff. I think it was unnecessarily brutal to try to force an emotional reaction out of the player, and I don't like that. I don't like that kind of emotional manipulation from movies and games. I think that's an underhanded way of presenting ideas. I don't like manipulative content, as it were. And on that note, there were a lot of like fake out deaths or whatever, particularly, and this is spoilers here, don't watch the rest of this video if you haven't finished the story and care about that. Joshua's death in the beginning, like, actually had some sort of levity to it, except for he didn't die and he ends up being the only surviving character in the game, which, you know, granted, the way that I think he ends up being, you know, the only surviving character writes the book or whatever. I think that's kind of neat. That's a nice little, it's one of the few redeeming qualities at the end of the story, but the point being, fake out deaths are lame. Don't do that. Once in a while, in a tasteful, narrative influencing sort of way, sure, but this game was very FF14, is how I would call it. If you've not played that game, I don't really know how to describe it better. And it's just it suffers from a melodramatic, almost like a, and I don't watch much anime, but I assume here it's really kind of an anime thing. Now, to sum it up, too much blood and gore and, you know, killing people and extreme violence in the cutscenes. I just couldn't get behind it. The same thing with the language. I've got a bit of a potty mouth myself. It's not like I'm trying to talk down to people who curse, but there's this like tasteful cursing that flows naturally through the course of language, and then there's what you get in this game. It felt like it was just too many fucks, you know, like a lot of unnecessary ones. A lot of Gav's dialogue felt awkward, and I felt like it kind of detracted from him as a character, which sucks, because Gav was, well, he was supposed to be a lovable character, like Clive's best friend or whatever, and he was close to living up to that if he weren't such a jackass with his dialogue. Like, it's just bad dialogue, you know? I would know something about bad dialogue listening to it right now. And it's not just the extreme language that is where the dialogue suffers. I mean, there's literal dick jokes in multiple places in the game. I don't think anything in the main main story stuff, but in a lot of the side content and little side conversations, you can see there's a lot of dick jokes. There's a lot of heavy content in there too, like not some philosophically heavy stuff like suicide and euthanasia and eugenics, and then on the more, morally questionable side of things, there's like, the whole arsenal of prostitutes that are across the game, both male and female, very openly about like their practices and stuff. I mean, it's weird shit, man. Again, I don't play video games for that stuff. It doesn't need to be there, right? Like maybe occasionally like a hint of that what's going on, that's nice, but like the egregious blatantcy, as it were, is what I have a problem with. That's what I would call it. It's just too much. They dial the edginess to 10 is how I would say it. To 11. They dial the edginess to 11. Spinal Tap levels of edginess, as it were. There's just some weird shit going on in the game. Like that one scene where King Odin is naked with his mom, who's actually Ultima. That shit's weird, dude. Like, what is that scene? Why does it need to be in the game? I get that you were trying to show me that he was a follower of Ultima, but what a fucking weird artistic choice, Like, I don't know. It felt like there was a lot of tasteless edginess just for the sake of, like, hey, we have an M rating, let's go ham, right? Like, that's what it felt like to me. And I felt like the game suffered for it. I felt like a lot of characters were developed in ways that were really, like kind of did them dirty. So Benedicta getting killed off in like the first 2 hours of gameplay was fucking lame, dude. Like she was kind of getting built up early to be something important and just really wasn't at all. Her relevance to me in my playthroughs is that she gave me the overpowered Garuda weapon, and I used that pretty much constantly since I got it, because it was overpowered. That's her relevance to me from a plot perspective. So that should tell you what they did with her character. I really liked Hugo at the beginning of the game, and then they just ruined him as a character for me. I'm going off on a tangent here. I guess we'll segue into another thing that I didn't like on this subject, but I really thought when I first played the game that we were going to get party members. I had not seen anything. Again, I was completely blind. I was like, yo, this Hugo guy is clearly the monk, right? Like he's the earth elemental guy. He's the monk. That's how this is going to work out. Benedicta's, I don't know, she's like the wind elemental healer. I don't know. We'll see. Wait. I got Torgal in the party, and I was like, oh god, please don't tell me. And I still had hope, and I kept having hope, and I kept having hope. And then Sid joined my party. And it was like, oh shit, there's no party members in this game. There's no party members at all. Your party member is your D-pad dog. And he doesn't even have a health bar. Like, Donald and Goofy in Kingdom Hearts 1 are more autonomous party members than what you get in this game. Like, you just get things that are less than guest characters from FF12. Like, guest characters you could control, they had health bars. Neither of those things are true in 16. I wanted to play a party in my first 3 hours of gameplay. I wanted to play a party that had Jill as a black mage, Clive as whatever the fuck he is, a fire knight, Hugo is an earth monk, and Benedicta is like a wind healer. I was like, okay, maybe that's where the game's going. That seems cool. And definitely missed opportunities in that regard. I think the game really lacked depth in its treasures and equipment systems, because you just had Clive, right? And the way that they chose to go about giving equipment for Clive was just asinine in some cases. We're kind of jumping around a bit here, but on that train of thought, the accessories that increase the damage for Odin-based spells, as it were, so for example like Gungnir or whatever the one is that flashes you back and forth, it's not the ultimate, but like the dancing steel damage as well, that is the ultimate attack or whatever. Like, you don't need damage on any of those attacks, man. They don't do damage even if you use them in a different stance. Like, their sole purpose is to build your Zantetsuken meter so that you can use an ability that is not them to do damage. Yet they just gave a blanket, like, template to be followed for every single piece of equipment in the game that resulted in some pieces that literally do nothing. It's like the developers didn't even pay attention to what they were making or didn't understand the implications of what they were making in some cases, which, you know, is kind of obvious of Rush. And let's at least be thankful that we got more game this time than 15. And I really do think that this game shows just how unfinished 15 really was when it came out. This is the true FF15 in my mind. Versus 13, aka the game I formerly referred to as 15, is definitely not a complete game. But 16 is needed. One party member, a bare bones equipment system that doesn't even make sense in some cases, like increasing the damage of the Odin abilities. The crafting system is very one-dimensional, boring, and kind of makes the very few pieces of equipment that do exist in the game feel kind of bland, boring. Not a lot of depth really in any of those systems. The only real depth that exists in the game at all, honestly, is in the combat. The second-by-second pacing of the combat and the very fast-paced choices that you have to make. That's where the game does have a lot of depth, admittedly, but in things like RPG character development, look at a game like 10. I'm playing through that one right now. Maxing out your characters on the sphere grid in that game, there's 7 of them. It's a tall order, man. There's a lot that has to be done to max out stats in that game, and I just got to level 100 with the Platinum Trophy in 16, and it didn't take much effort, just time, you know? As a matter of fact, I think the thing that took the most effort in the playthrough was just running around and doing all of the side quests. It wasn't the content of the quest, it wasn't like the fights or figuring out where to go or anything like that. It was actually just the slog of running from point A to point B to point C to pray return to the Waking Sands at the hideaway, and repeating that gameplay loop. That was about as strenuous as it gets. I think the game really did suffer from a lack of difficulty in general. I was going to say of difficult enemies, but just of difficulty in general. I think the modern trend of having everything like pointing out exactly where to go on your HUD and explaining everything, like having a quest log and shit like that, kind of sucks. Back in my day, we were in Lindblom on Disc 3 in FF9, and we had no idea that one of the 3 potions we needed to get was in that art studio that we couldn't even see because of CRT pixelated graphics, yada yada. Point being, the game was too easy. You have a lot of enemies in 16 will just stand there staring at you. Like, a lot of basic enemies will just stand there staring at you. And other ones will just charge at you from off screen with not even as much of a audio cue that they're coming to hit you, and you can't see shit, and it's basically unreactable. So the game's got a really weird spread of difficulty, but at the end of the day, I don't think anything comes even remotely close to like Virgil 3 on Dante Must Die mode in C3. And while I liked doing all of the hunts, especially like going out and finding them, that was probably the most enjoyable part. Some of the fights were fun. Svarog comes to mind as being a particularly fun hunt. I actually can't think off the top of my head of any other ones that are really that stand out. Maybe Atlas was decent. I think Atlas was actually the first time I kind of said, okay, that was kind of a hard fight in the game on normal mode. But yeah, in DMC3, for example, just about every enemy in the game, except for the most basic enemy, all of them but one, was threatening enough to change the way you had to approach gameplay, and 16's enemies just left a lot to be desired. Also, I think the game suffers a lot from side questitis, if that makes sense. The side quests are... I sent a text to a friend of mine, my exact words were, these are the worst side quests I've ever seen in a Final Fantasy game. And they kinda stayed that way for me. I don't know. 15's got some pretty meh side quests, as does 13. 13 really feels like it kind of lacks side quests, but This game certainly didn't lack for side quests, but it lacked for meaningful side quests. I can't think off the top of my head a single side quest that I actually look up back on and go, you know what, that was a great experience. It's just like a bunch of World of Warcraft / Final Fantasy 14. I think actually the latter is the better way to think about it. If you've played FF14 and you've done quests in that game that are not main scenario quests or side quests or whatever, it felt a lot like that. Just really inconsequential, minor things. Compare that to like the Stelazio side quest in FF9 or, you know, the Chocobo breeding in FF7. I don't know. The game just, you know, it didn't have anything in that regard. The items system was boring. We've already talked about the equipment, but the items was also boring. As you got a main series Final Fantasy game with no Phoenix Downs. What's that all about? There's no party members to use it on. I'm pretty sure last elixirs don't even work. I died several times with one in my inventory. Maybe that's just a hard mode thing, but I died on normal mode to extinction from the behemoth when I had one in my inventory too, and that shit didn't work. So is it just like a waste of 20,000 gil? Is it just there for completionism? Is it there to look pretty? I don't know. But on the note of completionism, this is a just fucking terrible game for completionism. The equipment's boring. Completion in this game would amount to fully upgraded everything, and then the unique items. So an example of that would be like you get an icon-based accessory every time you beat one of the chronoliths. So like you get Gigaflare damage for Bahamut after you beat the Bahamut chronolith. You can only get one of those per playthrough. So I mean, technically, if you really wanted to go the full stretch for completionism, you can do infinite repeats of Final Fantasy mode on a New Game Plus. So you could have whatever the cap number of every one of those slightly different accessories is. Like it's one that reduces the cooldown of a given ability, one that increases the damage, and that's it. And it's like that for every single accessory, except for Odin, who I think has a slightly different one in that Dancing Steel. There's actually a really useful accessory that's kind of broken for Dancing Steel. I use that to power level myself at the end of the game because I realized that you could just fill up as on Tetsuken with one of those things. But yeah, aside from that, it's a really boring equipment system that would just feel like tedious busy work for the sake of maxing it out, doing up to 99 playthroughs of the game for the sake of doing it. Very bad 100% playthrough. The treasure chests are all over the place. Most of them are filled with useless crafting materials either way, and I say useless because the items you're going to be crafting don't use that shit anyway. I went through the game pretty much always immediately crafting the best thing that I could get, assuming that I had the materials for it. I almost always did because I killed a lot of shit. And I have like 9,999 bloody hides. I don't know if I ever used bloody hides. You know, there's just like materials that serve no purpose. The crafting system has almost no depth, and a lot of the items are just there to be there, and that's the best interpretation of it I can come up with. The chronolith trials suck, especially on Final Fantasy mode. 100% would entail getting S ranks in every one of those, and that's not fun. A lot of those ability combos are things that you would never use. Ever. Who in their right mind is going to use... I don't know, let me think of a good one. Bahamut. Right, the end of Bahamut's trial. You get Gigaflare and Flare Breath, right? To fight a single target boss. Okay, maybe that's a bad example. The Flare Breath's actually good against the ads in the start of Wave 4 and Bahamut. But you get what I'm saying, right? Like some of those combos, you're never going to use Heat Wave and Scarlet Cyclone, you know? Like, I never used Heat Wave once when I was playing these games with bad abilities, dude. They stick you with bad abilities, with arbitrary time limits, tell you not to take any damage in a janky combat system that can hit you from off screen. You know, like, Devil May Cry 3 is way harder than this game. I haven't really touched on that yet. We'll kind of jump around a little bit more here, sorry about that. Devil May Cry 3's final boss on DMD mode hurt me. Physically, mentally, emotionally. It took me like 30 hours real time. I slept obviously, but I spent most of my free time those 2 days, at least 12 plus hours a day, grinding attempts on DMD Virgil 3, just getting my ass handed to me. And that shit broke me, man. Like, that was hard. This game, I one-shot Ultima, you know, on Final Fantasy, but I didn't die to him. I barely died to anything. The things that I did die to, it was like, oh, hey, yeah, you got me. I died to something stupid. I wasn't paying attention, you know, little things. But yeah, this game wasn't hard, but there was a lot of bullshit that it threw at you, namely in terms of off-screen stuff. DMC3 at least has the courtesy that monsters just kind of ignore you if they're off-screen. This game, you better be fucking psychic or have a really good feel for the general timing and general attack pattern of enemies that you can't see. Because the only indicator that you get that something's coming from off-screen, and they are coming from off-screen, believe you me, is a little yellow flash from like their target square on the HUD, if you've seen it. But that doesn't tell you. That just means an enemy is doing an attack. And a lot of the attacks in this game have like delayed hurtbox release times, or however you want to call it. Like they have long animations is what I'm trying to get at. Annoyingly long animations at times that makes dodging them kind of janky, because it's like, okay, when are they going to actually throw out this attack that they've been animating for 2 seconds now? You know, it's dumb shit like that. It's not hard, it's janky, and it's inconsiderate in the fact that it throws attacks at you from off-screen. And again, I think the Final Fantasy difficulty hard mode trial S ranks have sealed the deal in my disinterest in ever 100%ing the game. It's a damn shame that we couldn't have, you know, an FF6-like game with the depth of party members. And it's just a lot that was too awkward or heavy-handed with how they handle a lot of aesthetic and narrative choices in the game. For a while, I thought the dialogue was really good. Actually, it started out with me thinking, not the dialogue, I'm sorry, the plot. At first, it started out with me thinking that the plot was very bad, up until just a little bit past the massacre at Phoenix Gate. I was like, okay, this game is just, what the hell? Did I waste $100 on this? But easily by 8 hours after that, I was like, okay, this is one of the most fun gaming experiences I've ever had. And I've just spent the last 20 minutes, you know, shitting on the game, as it were. But at the same time, I still think this is one of the most pure, mainly in terms of the way that I experienced it, being completely blind and everything, just figuring out for myself. But a very genuinely fun gaming experience, despite not being what I wanted out of it. So yeah, I really don't think there's too much more to say about what I didn't like. I wish that there would have been optional content that was challenging, you know, like there was no Yasmat, there was no Omega, there was no Ruby weapon, no Omega weapon, no Ozma. You guys know what I'm getting at. Like, there was no big, crazy, scary super boss. Like, I mean, it's been that way for several games since 12. Like, 13's super boss was a fucking long neck Adamantoise. Lame. I'm pretty sure Adamantoise was the super boss in 15 as well. I didn't really fuck around with that game outside of a story playthrough, so I can't say for sure. But if that's the case, lame. This game's super boss, King Behemoth, I guess. What's more of a super boss? I personally, in my normal mode playthrough, I thought Svarog, the dragon who you fight in Mornburn, I think it is, in the Sandbreck region. He's one of the mid-game hunts. I thought that was a pretty challenging encounter. That was the one that really made me figure out dragon mechanics in that game. It felt borderline like Ultimate mechanics at some point, like how the mechanics would show themselves to you and then build, and you'd be seeing combinations of mechanics thrown at you in the same time. It really felt like FF14 Ultimates on fights like Svarog, but you know, King Behemoth was just a dumb fight, dude. For his meteor mechanic, I just Shiva glide the fuck out of there and get away from him and range it. It was an easy fight. I didn't really die to any of the hard fights. The only hunts that I died to on this playthrough, as a matter of fact, on the Final Fantasy mode, were multi-target fights. I died to the wasps because they all just like insta-give me at once. I was like, okay, you got me. I'll not die to that again. And I died to the bombs. again, I think it was just an insta-gib kind of, like, I just didn't avoid their simultaneous attack and they all hit me at once kind of bullshit. Point being, it's the two target situations that you end up in that are the challenging bit. But even then, there was nothing in the game that I really felt like I was racking my brain against, except for a handful of the Chrono trials on Final Fantasy mode. I felt like Bahamut Phoenix in particular were pretty brutal to get through. Those were pretty skill based, honestly. There was a lot of you can't fuck up in that, but it wasn't fun. It was artificial challenge in bad ways, and I think that's a good way to sum up a lot about my negative feelings about the game, is that it tries to pretend like there's depth when the depth that happens to exist is either half-assed or fake. So yeah, that's enough shitting on the game. Let's talk about what was good. One area that the game definitely did not lack in depth was combat. I've never really been a big fan of the stagger mechanic in 13. In that game, stagger kind of worked out to do what you can to fill the bar as quickly as possible to stagger the enemy while not dying. And the nuance in that game's combat came down to balancing staggering the enemy quickly with not dying, because certain paradigm setups were much more tanky or survivable or whatever than others. So you'd juggle surviving and filling the stagger bar, and then once the stagger bar filled, you'd go into like triple commando or whatever your highest damage output source was, like 2 commandos, 1 ravage or whatever. In this game, I do think the filling of the stagger bar is a bit more nuanced, but it doesn't have as much of a nuanced balancing act as 13, if that makes sense. So 13 has that defensive offensive balancing act that I mentioned. This game, the defensive side of things comes in like the fighting game dodging shit aspect of it, right? So it's kind of divorced from the combat choices that you're making. Whereas in 13, it's intricately related to the combat choices that you're making. But on the offensive side of things in the 16, balancing your ability cooldowns with getting the most uses per meaningful engagement, and just to clarify what I mean by that, it's basically like the old optimization rule of cooldown usage of you want to get the maximum number of uses per fight, and then once you've determined like what the maximum possible number of uses are, if there's any wiggle room where like you have extra time that it's just not going to come up during, that's when you start considering shifting usage timing to areas with more uptime. And I won't get into the nuances of damage optimization because I'm honestly no expert at it. But in this game, there's like a fine balance offensively of using your cooldowns as much as you can, as well with saving them for that big moment of getting the enemy staggered and then, you know, building up to a 1.5 multiplier and hitting for 1600 plus per hit with Gigaflare. You know, I think my highest stagger was like 359,000 or something with Clive, not Ifrit or whatever. I was able to pretty consistently get between 250 and 350,000 at the end of the game. I didn't like to use on Tetsuken because it required a lot of meticulous setup. Yeah, I guess let's go ahead and back up a bit, and we'll talk about the combat system, because I do think it did a lot right. I think Clive is one of the most badass characters that I've ever played in a video game from like a mechanical standpoint. Controls were excellent. I give this game the same praise that I gave to Kingdom Hearts 3. It feels good to play. The character moves just like you want them to move when you press the buttons. It's very responsive. It controls well. I want to say that it's not clunky. There are things that the game does that are clunky. Like it makes clunky mechanical choices that it forces on you. Cough, Bahamut. We'll get to those. But it's smooth and responsive in its basic controls. I like how they implemented the summoner into a fighter. I guess is the way to put it. So like Clive is kind of a summoner, right? Like he uses all of the eidolons or icons or whatever you want to call them. Like he uses their power to empower his melee ability. He's kind of like a summoner knight kind of deal going on. That's really well done mechanically. Like I don't like the idea. Don't get me wrong. I think it's stupid. I think it's a bad implementation from a Final Fantasy standpoint, as I said earlier. But how they fleshed it out is just really, really good. Even if they did copy a lot of the shit out of DMC3. There's a wide range in the kit. Like it's not a perfectly balanced kit of abilities where everything has its place in situational uses. No. I can go ahead and say that there are some abilities, and I used all of them at some point. I did all the chrono lists. Remember, they'll force the abilities on you. And I did a little bit of experimentation with everything. I found a setup that I think worked for me for most of the game. It was to run with Phoenix with Flames of Rebirth on square for my big trash AoE clearing ability, as well as huge damage during 1.5 stagger. And then Rising Flames actually was a really solid ability all throughout the game. I used that a lot. It was one-shotting to half-healthing most enemies in the game all the way through the game, and it has a very low cooldown, and it was just a nice trash clearing slash damaging ability. I could fit 2 in per stagger pretty reliably if I managed my cooldowns well, and it was just a really strong ability. Garuda, as we'll get to when I talk about it, I used Garuda from the minute that I got her, and I don't think I ever stopped using her because her circle ability or whatever is Wicked Talon, the Death Grip ability. Like, I don't even care about pulling things to me. The being able to stun lock shit at 50% stagger, I mean, it's not like actual stun lock, but getting more downtime on the enemy where you're not having to dodge them, which equates to more damage uptime, and you do get, like, I think it's a 1 point something. You get a damage boost while they're in that down anyway, for sure. So, like, you throw a Rising Flame, throw a Thunderstorm, you're cooking, man. Garuda is a very, very powerful thing. I didn't actually use her abilities at all. I used Thunderstorm and Judgment Bolt on triangle and square respectively for pretty much the entire game. Sometimes I'd switch out just a pile drive from Thunderstorm, but still, like, Judgment Bolt one-shots basically any trash mob in the game. Huge damage. Try to use it with a 1.5 stagger multiplier. Yeah. But I ended up spending most of my time in Shiva stance because, well, Permafrost is broken, as we'll get to. I used Diamond Dust because it's also broken for staggering enemies, and Giga Flare. So yeah, let's break down the combat and kind of talk about what I think about it. Before we get into the icons, Clive's basic kit is kind of neat. It's like a hybrid between Dante from Devil May Cry and Squall from Final Fantasy VIII. They did a really nice homage to the Gunblade from FF8 mechanically, even if they didn't intend to do that, even if they coincidentally weren't inspired by the Gunblade. I like how you have the option to hit a trigger kind of mechanic after every single melee hit, so it's like square, triangle, square, triangle, square, triangle. It was fun to learn the timing of that and master it, I guess. I can hit that pretty reliably, like 90-95% of the time. So yeah, even if they didn't mean to like have a nod to FF8 there, it was cool for it to be there, and it definitely felt like a nod to me. Aerial combat feels great. Clive's Stinger equivalent, Sonic Blade, whatever you want to call it. I don't remember the actual name where he slides across the ground. That plus Magic Burst is enough to get you through every stunnable enemy in the normal mode version of the game. It's just like actually crazy. You cover so much distance just sliding around. Very broken ability, very strong ability, very abusable ability. And a lot of Clive's kit feels abusable when you learn how to master, which I guess is always fun. It's just, it doesn't take a ton of effort to master. It's definitely no Royal Guard from DMC3. I've pretty much mastered the timing for Titan, playing it reactively as an offensive build, in the same way that you would with Royal Guard from DMC3, and it's just so much more lenient with the timings and stuff. You have way much more of a frame leniency, or whatever you want to call it, but Yeah, I mean, there's not a ton to say about Clive's base melee kit. You know, it's his base melee kit. Feels good. It's fluid. I like the gunblade trigger, magic burst stuff. It's nice. He feels really good in the air. Magic in this game sucks. Don't think there are any gust spells that you can cast other than when you're playing as Joshua at the beginning of the game, which on that note, Joshua's a badass. That was very neat, and I wish, there was more of playing as other characters like that in the game, but I digress. The magic was lame. At the beginning of the game, I was using it a lot, and it felt kind of strong, just charging to, raw level. But by the end of the game, melee was by far outpacing it, and I really didn't like how it stun locked you when you cast it. Like, it forces you backwards, and you lose control of your character for half a second. Very lame. Didn't feel great to cast magic in that game. I liked spamming the magic, like the just fire or death, or dark, whatever it was. Just spamming the base level spell was nice, but it did, piddly dick damage. Tickled. Very underwhelming magic in this game. Better than 15, but that's not saying very much. And sadly, I have to say that 13 did magic better than I feel like 16 did, and that sucks, because 13's magic is pretty boring too. It's just like, okay, this is a stagger ability, and this is an AoE stagger ability, and this is a more hurdy AoE stagger ability, and yeah, this is Curaja. What the fuck is Curasa? I didn't like 13's magic by any means, but better than 16. Sorry, gotta say it. I know this is supposed to be a section where we say positive things, but I'm just trying to talk about Clive as a fighter now, because I do think they did really well with Clive in general. Phoenix felt great to use. It was a great starter one. I like Phoenix Shift. It felt good to help you get around to enemies in combat. I used it a lot during my playthrough. Like I said before, Rising Flames is like a sleeper ability. Maybe people know it's overpowered. I haven't really been paying attention to media. To me, it felt very strong, and like the game kind of points you away from it to other abilities, but it was my old faithful throughout literally the entire playthrough. Flames of Rebirth, I had that shit maxed since I could max it. I did a little early game grinding, got early Flames of Rebirth. Didn't realize that mastering just let you use it in different stances, so I kind of wasted some time there, but I used Rebirth Flame throughout pretty much the entire game too. It was very strong to deal damage during stagger for a single target, as well as being a powerhouse for AoE clearing. I used that for a lot of my early game power leveling until I realized that you could use on Tetsuken on a faster cooldown. I was alternating the two until I realized, holy shit, there's an ability that I can just use on Tetsuken. But yeah. The other Phoenix abilities, Scarlet Cyclone, it's not bad. It's longer cooldown, and it's more situational use compared to Rising Flame. Maybe not use it. Heatwave sucked. It was cool when you could like hit projectile counters with it, I guess. I really only saw that in the trials because I didn't really use it much. It was a kind of lame ability otherwise, though. I think that's all we can really talk about with Phoenix. Garuda's Gouge was great for building stagger and stagger multiplier. Shit is crazy. I didn't end up using it at in-game, but I can't say it's bad by any means. There's no other way to say this. Wicked Wheel's overpowered. Like, that's one of the best stagger hitting abilities in the game. Like, it causes stagger like a motherfucker. It's a very short cooldown, and it makes things get staggered quickly. I didn't like Rook's Gambit, but when you hit the defensive counter with it or whatever, it feels very good to use. And Aerial Blast is insane. It's very chaotic. You can't see a lot of visual tells from enemies who don't get stun locked in it, who are sucked into the middle of it. I didn't use it a lot. It was a little laggy, and it was a little visually much for me, but in a good way. I liked it. It was aesthetically pleasing. It just wasn't really for me mechanically. I didn't find good use for it. I didn't feel like it did a ton of damage. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Ramu is also pretty broken. So like, whereas Garuda's base kit, Wicked Talon or whatever that we already talked about, is probably the most broken ability in the game. Amu is... his abilities are good and his base circle ability is trash. I didn't really see any point to the thing where you can target 9 things with lightning. I don't remember its name. Pile Drive was cool. I didn't use it a lot because Thunderstorm does more damage during stagger. At least I'm pretty sure it does. Lightning Rod is broken as fuck. I didn't use that nearly as much as I should have. I realized that in the Chronolith trials, just how insane that ability is. Use Lightning Rod. Shit's nuts. It's a little hard to get enemies hit by, but surprisingly easier than you think. Definitely than I thought. And Judgment Bolt is insane damage. It's probably the second or third highest damaging ability in the game for a single target. You can do a little cleave with it, but it's not reliable. Titan is weird. I think it's actually pretty bad. As a matter of fact, Titan might actually get my vote for the worst or the second worst of all of the icons. It's good with what it tries to be, it just doesn't reward you enough. Like, it's really slow to fill the stagger bar. And it's really bad at dealing damage to staggered targets, I feel like. It does reward precision hits for trash clearing. Like, you can mow some shit down if they're like lesser targets, but against things with stagger bars, Titan's really underwhelming. It can be fun to play defensively, but again, it changes the way you play the game completely. It requires you to just kind of sit there and wait and bait hits and then respond to hits. It's a slower paced gameplay style that just kind of causes it to not be great. And unfortunately, the way that rewards it, it's not like Royal Guard and DMC3 where you're basically like one-shotting enemies or taking half of a boss's life in DMD mode or some crazy shit like that. You are just like whittling shit down in a very stone-paced play style, if I will, so I'm not a big fan of Titan. Bahamut, I was very conflicted on. I loved it at first when I got it, until it started sinking in that, man, it takes way too long for Mega Flare to actually be useful. And it's really gimmicky, honestly. How long it takes to charge up a Mega Flare just isn't worth it. I can genuinely say that. So Bahamut has some sick abilities. Flare Breath is insane. To be able to just like pick up a bunch of trash and carry them around and kill them, anything that doesn't have a stagger bar just basically gets vacuumed up and eaten by Flare Breath. It's crazy. Satellite does insane damage. Impulse does very respectable damage and stun locks 4 things. I think it's 4 things. Giga Flare is the single most damaging ability in the game. I think I can hit, like 100,000 damage just on a single Giga Flare. It's crazy. But Mega Flare just takes too... Like, Mega Flare was one of my favorite abilities. I think it might still be my favorite ability, even with how clunky it is to use. So, unfortunately, Bahamut as a stance falls behind, but Giga Flare is ubiquitous enough that I would put it in front of Titan, honestly. I would call Shiva's stance the most broken one in the game. Because Diamond's Dust is hands down the best thing to stagger enemies in the game. Some things it just instantly staggers. Some things it instantly puts to half stagger, which in combination with Garuda is awesome. Because at half stagger, Garuda's Wicked Talon can stun them. Yeah, Diamond Dust is crazy. Permafrost is probably the most broken thing in that game. There are some enemies that it's just like dodge, freeze them for 8 seconds. They come out, dodge, freeze them for 8 seconds, and you're just perma-freezing things if you're playing well. It's kind of crazy. I sat in Shiva's stance pretty much constantly from the time that I figured that out, which was around the time that I got it. 'Cause I had a lot of AP that I was stacking up, and I bought all my abilities early, tested them out, and I realized pretty quickly, oh shit, this basic ability is insane. Yeah, just being able to pretty much on-demand insta-freeze briefly, even if you don't hit the precision dodge, it's pretty broken. But her other abilities aren't great. The combo of Rhyme into Mesmerize is actually pretty good. but only for stunnable enemies. Rhyme is terrible on non-stunnable enemies. And Ice Age I just consider to be underwhelming in general. Odin is an interesting one. I'd like to reiterate that the developers don't understand Odin, or at least the person who designed accessories didn't. Like, they just didn't get the memo that all of Odin's damage was baked into Zantetsuken. I tested this, and I could be just completely mistaken because I did only briefly test this, like a couple of uses, but I'm pretty sure none of Odin's abilities do any damage, even if you use them in other icon stances. Their sole purposes for existing is to fill the Zantetsuken meter, which, when you realize that Dancing Steel can do that with a single use, kind of makes the other abilities useless. Rift Lapse, or whatever it is, the time-altering ability that's straight out of DMC3, I didn't like that one. It's weird, it's janky. I got some use out of it in the Chronolith trials, but it was just not useful. Like, you gotta think, when you put an ability like that into your kit, you're losing stagger damage, right? And this game is just all about the stagger damage. Stagger damage is king. Or at least in my experience, that's what it was.
Come on. Fly, Ambrosia.
Maybe the speedrunners will prove it different. But an ability like that, taking up a slot of an ability that can do tens of thousands of damage and stagger, is just not a worthwhile trade-off. And of course, Dancing Steel has a definite case to be one of the most broken abilities in the game because it instantly gives you a Zantetsuken, which instantly kills basically everything around you that's not a big enemy. Fun fact, I killed Final Fantasy mode Ultima with a level 5 Zantetsuken, and it felt great. I love fucking around with Odin in that game. It's a little too clunky to rely on for a lot of the game. I switched out Phoenix for Odin at the end from that setup I mentioned earlier, just for fun. But Phoenix is more reliable, and I think it's more brain dead than setting up Dancing Steels with Odin. I would use a damaging ability in Odin's last slot. Probably, I think I used Rising Flames rather than another, because you don't need another ability. Dancing Steel is enough to just fill it alone. No reason to use any other ability in this kit. But yeah, I mean, I like his kit. It felt good. I learned it. I wanted to learn it. That's why I learned it. I learned it because it was fun to learn. It was fun to learn to implement. It's just a shame there was no like really challenging encounter. But to be fair, I feel like Clive as a character is janky enough that a fight like Sephiroth in KH1 might not be fun with this game's setup. You know, I might get DLC in this game. Actually, we'll see. I'm a big anti-DLC kind of person, but if there's a good boss fight in this game, you know, it might be on the table. So other things outside of combat that I think this game did well, obviously it was beautiful. It's one of the best looking games I've ever played. Not perfect. A lot of frame rate problems with distant objects, particularly at the end of the game. An egregious area would be the Great South Gate, when looking at it from the Vita Grace side of things. Vita Grace, however you want to say it. It just was 10 FPS kind of lag, and on a modern PS5 system, that shouldn't be acceptable. The game was poorly optimized toward the end, but other than a few things like that, it looked outstanding. Like I said earlier, music was great. The general plot was engaging. I really wanted to see how it resolved. I don't really like how it resolved. I felt like the end was unsatisfying. It was just kind of like, and it's over. Ultima was iffy villain, better than Arden, better than Bartandalus. Better than Vayne. Now, Vayne was a different kind of villain. So, like, Vayne was like a human political villain. Ultima was like an otherworldly philosophical villain. I don't know. It wasn't good philosophy either. For a while when they first started talking about the will, I was like, oh hey, maybe there'll be some thought-provoking subject matter in this. Maybe we'll get another FF9 here. Nope. 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 Very shallow, very anime. Again, I'm not much of an anime guy, but from what I know about anime, this game felt like that. A lot of very FF14 feel to this game. Very unabashed dialing of 11 in a lot of ways. Sometimes for good, not always though. What else did the game do well? There was a lot of stuff. I cannot say that this game was lacking in content because it took me a while to do everything. But I also have to say that it's unfinished because it lacks things like super bosses, and it just... There were certain times in the game when it was just like, okay, this feels like there was more to it. Like the crafting system being another example, or the equipment system, maybe even party members. It did feel like, even with all the time that they had for it, and with Yoshi P at the helm, that it did ultimately come out to be a bit of a rushed experience. So in summation, it was not what I wanted from a Final Fantasy game. It, in a very Final Fantasy way, borrowed from a lot of other games to try to reinvent the genre in a way that I personally don't really like. But for what it ended up being, I can't deny that it was a very well-made game that was very fun to play. It felt good to play well in that game. I can say that. So when you had a good fight that you played well for a while, and you get to that, ending screen or whatever, it felt good. It was a fun experience in that regard. But it doesn't even crack the top 10 in my Final Fantasy preferences. Does that mean that it's a bad game? No. Almost every Final Fantasy game is a great game. 15, 13, and 2 withstanding, of course. Cough, cough. This is a great game. It's just not a great Final Fantasy game. I hope that someday we get a really heavily party-based, maybe even turn-based FF game, but the FF7 remake has kind of killed any hopes that I have for that. I'm never going to buy that, I don't think. Just because I don't want to play FF7 like that. I like turn-based FF7. If they would have taken the original FF7 exactly as it was, point for point, gameplay-wise, like I hear a little rumor they may be doing with FF9, cough, cough, cough. If they could just have taken the exact game but given it new graphics and full voice acting, chef's kiss. Perfect. That's all I need from a game, dude. FF7's, as you can clearly see, not even one of my favorite Final Fantasy games. But it's a damn good game, and I wish that they would handle... I wish that they would see that. I wish that they would see that turn-based doesn't have to be dead, and it can be done really, really interestingly. Turn-based can be skill-based. Look at FF10. My friend sucks at hitting Wakka's abilities. And Tidus's thing, and Auron's thing, he's... God bless his soul. Founder help him. Alright, this discussion has surpassed an hour at this point. What do I give this game? My gut reaction is a 7 out of 10. And it clawed its way there. Early on I was thinking like 4, maybe 3.5. It clawed its way to a 7 out of 10. And it earned it. It's a very imperfect game. I don't know if I'll ever play it again. I got the Platinum Trophy. I did all that I wanted to do, all the meaningful 100% content. There's just like busy work checklist stuff to do that in this game is boring. So I think I washed my hands of 16 forever until DLC, maybe. Not really interested in speedrunning it. It was good. It was good. Shoutouts to Yoshi P. If you made it all the way through this, thanks for listening to my rambling.